Hi, everyone. Am I seen and heard? I hope. Give me some thumbs.
Loud and clear. You're great.
Wonderful. Okay. It's really a great honor and privilege to be here at the Yemei Iyun for Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. They told me to introduce myself, but we don't have enough time for that. So I'm just going to say, hi, Judy Klitsner. I've been teaching Torah Tanakh at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies for the past 30 plus years. And I have been teaching at this wonderful, these Yemei Iyun for close to whatever, how many decades they've been around. And I'm here to learn with you. You'll find out more about me as we learn. So let's just get to it, shall we? First of all, what you need to know about me is that it has been my contention for a very long time that the Tanakh contains within it a vibrant conversation, that stories are in a kind of dialogue with each other. And what our tip-off as to that dialogue is the fact that they borrow each other's language, they borrow each other's themes, and in order to sometimes to comment on one another, to expand on one another. And at times, and this is what I find the most intriguing, sometimes they are in conversation with one another in order to not just mine each other, but to undermine each other. And I am so excited about this method that I spent a lot of time writing this book. See, I told you I was going to tell you more about myself. I wrote this book called Subversive Sequels in the Bible, How Biblical Stories Mine and Undermine Each Other. So the first level when we draw these stories together is to see what they have in common, how they expand and interpret one another. But where things really get interesting is to see how one story is going to borrow the language and themes of another, only to challenge its assumptions and sometimes even to overturn its conclusions. And the result of this kind of inquiry, this kind of study, is that the biblical story is seen as much longer, much more complex, much more dynamic. It's a story in motion, right? We think we've hit the end of a story, and then we see that that storyline is picked up again with similar language and spun out in a surprising new way. Personally, I have found this method especially useful when approaching some of the Bible's most difficult stories. And of course, high on the list of the Bible's difficult stories are the stories that center on biblical women. And I am so interested in this and have been so troubled by it that I devote fully half of that book to this question. And now that I'm really going to reveal much more about myself by telling you that I'm confessing here that this might be because of my own personal sense of unfinished business. Okay, I was educated in the Beit Yaakov system. My teachers were very fond of characterizing what they would call the biblical woman, right? There's a biblical woman, as if there were as if it were possible to paint a monolithic portrait of biblical women. And if you wanted to know what goes into that monolithic portrait, all you need to do is look at the matriarchs in the book of Bereshit. And this I found very troubling, not just because it was so monolithic, but also because it was presented as prescriptive. Right? And I couldn't help noticing that the prescriptive portrait was suspiciously similar to the rest of the agenda that was being promoted, which was very heavy on tzniut, on modesty, especially dressing well, being in the background, not being seen and heard. Right? And the formula went something like this: biblical women are, fill in the blanks, right? In the background, unseen, unheard. So should you, good Jewish girl, also be all of those things. So I was troubled for most of my high school years. And it was only years later that I realized that there was actually something much deeper and more subtle that was troubling me even more than that. And that was the question itself. The question of what is a biblical woman? Even to ask that question presupposes a kind of outsider status, right? That she's some kind of a curiosity to be held under a microscope and studied by the primary people, humans, the scientists, who are obviously the men. No one would have thought of asking a question similar to this question of what is a biblical woman about what is a biblical man or a biblical human being, but it was clear that there was no one model, there was no limit to the capabilities and potential of that being. Years later, I was surprised and dismayed to read some of this gentleman's works, Sigmund Freud, and I was kind of amazed to notice the persistent nature of this line of thinking, this kind of cross-cultural similarity. Here's the father of psychoanalysis famously asking this question, the great question that has never been answered and which I have not yet been able to answer despite my 30 years of research into the feminine soul is, what does a woman want? Poor man could not answer this question. But the assumption that goes into it, again, just like my teachers in Beit Yaakov, was that the primary human beings are men. They are observing and diagnosing, right, doing their best to make sense of this other kind of creature, and all the while kind of lumping them together as if all of these people are the same, and in this case, as if they all want the same thing. And what I want to do with you in the short time that we have is to try to demonstrate that the Tanakh itself, I believe, rejects this kind of question. And as we uncover this vibrant conversation that's going on within Tanakh, from one story about a biblical woman to another, we're going to note how much broader the conversation is, how much more dynamic women's portraits are, right? They're in motion. How much women are an integral part of humanity in all of its permutations. They're not presented as a part, as separate to be observed and commented on. Okay, that's all by way of introduction. And now what I want to do is, first of all, just actually still a little bit more background. If we were going to paint a portrait of the women in Bereshit, we would have to admit that there are certain similarities that they share, and that a lot of these characteristics do conform to what some of my teachers were saying. First of all, these women are focused almost exclusively on motherhood, right? And in fact, they're so focused on childbirth that some will express the notion that without the ability to have children, their lives have no purpose. And we're going to look at this more in a moment. And it seems basically, if we were going to pose Freud's question to the book of Bereshit, what do women want? Women want children. But we note that to the dismay of the women in the book, in these child-focused stories, we find that all four of the matriarchs, or at least at some point in their lives, they're infertile, right? So they can't have children. They desperately want children. Making things even worse is the fact that the only antidote to infertility is going to be a direct act of God to open women's wombs, and there's nothing subtle about that in the way that the text presents it. These women are then dependent on their husbands, who are the only ones who have access to God. God is not speaking to the women in this book, but the men don't always step up and do what it is that the women need them to do. One of the things that we note in the book of Bereshit is that the matriarchs are, in fact, often in the background in their tents. That is their natural habitat. That's where they live. And I would say the tent is symbolic of a cultural role. The patriarchs are the face to the world, where the women are behind the scenes, often manipulating things because they don't have any power. And if you're wondering what this nice woman is doing here, this is from the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which could have just as easily been called My Big Fat Jewish Wedding, where she explains the man is the head, but the woman is the neck, right? Moving the man's head wherever it needs to go. But she doesn't dare say these things out loud. She has to be a kind of subtle neck mover. Okay. So they have all of these basic similarities in this book, yet at the same time, and what I hope to demonstrate is we look more closely, what we're going to find even in this book, the book of Bereshit, before we get to the subversive stories in later books, we're going to see some glimmers of other possibilities which do not conform to type. And that in order to really understand them, we have to tread very carefully in characterizing them. After we look at these women more carefully, we're going to go on to the next level, which is to question the assumptions of the book of Bereshit in a much more extreme way, as we go out of the Chumash and into the subversive conversation that's happening between the stories in Bereshit and the stories that are centered on women in the book of Judges. Okay, so with all that, we need to get to work. Our first team are Sarah and Avraham. And the story begins with, I would say, with exclusion. both by God and by Avraham. And these are texts that I know you've all seen many, many times, but I want to put a slightly different emphasis on them. When God first speaks to Avraham, Vayomer Hashem el Avram, Lech lecha, me'artzecha, umimoladetecha, right? All the pronouns here are second person singular, your homeland, your place. El ha'aretz asher ar'eka, I'm going to show you a place. I will make you a great nation. Where is Sarah, or Sarai as she's known at this point? She is completely absent. And we notice that the other side of this conversation is also exclusive, where Avraham notices that time is passing and he's not having children. And he says to God, Mati tein li, what can you give me? Va'anochi holech haribi, I am childless. And then God speaks to him and says, don't worry, lo yirashcha zeh, this one will not inherit you, but someone who comes from mime'echa. Again, it's in the singular, you, Avraham, will have a child. And what we see here is that I think if we could put this to music, we would have some dark chords playing in the background, because Sarai is introduced to us as in a kind of doubly vulnerable situation, which is that she is an akara. She's not in a text that is both child-centered and male-centered and progeny-centered. Here is a woman who is unable to conceive. How does Sarah, or Sarai Sarah, feel about this exclusion? She's silent up until, throughout her narrative, until we get to chapter 16, where she speaks for the very first time. And here we're told, and we have to read between the lines because the text does not tell us what people are feeling emotionally, but it does drop some very, very often subtle and really fascinating clues. The Sarai Eshet Avram lo yalda lo, okay, she's defined as the wife of Avram, did not bear him a child, and she has this Egyptian maid by the name of Hagar. Vatomer Sarai el Avram, hine na atzarani Hashem miledet. And she says to her husband, behold, God has stopped me from bearing children. Bo na el shifchati, I like this translation, consort with my maid. Ulai ibaneh mimena. This is a wonderful verb, ibaneh. Perhaps literally, I will be built through her. We might hear the resonance of the word ben, of son. Perhaps I will be sunned through her. But what I think is even more resonant is this verb, which has been used only once before in the book of Bereshit regarding a biblical woman. And that, of course, is in the Garden of Eden, where we're told that the very first woman is constructed, vayiven. God constructs woman out of the side of man. And is it possible here that when Sarai says, Ulai ibaneh mimena, that she is intimating that she feels that construction is now being called into question, maybe even unbuilt by God, this kind of this kind of dismantling of this careful construction. Without a child, there is no substance. I'm left with nothing. Okay, so far I would say that many of the stereotypes that of my early education have been substantiated, but let's now look for signs of some subtle pushback. Here, God finally enters the picture in a new way, and I would say in a more inclusive way. Here in chapter 17 in Bereshit, where God says to Avraham for the first time, all those conversations that I was having with you about your child, let me now expand on that and tell you that really I've been talking about your wife Sarah as well. Uverachti ota, right? I will bless her. V'gam natati mimena lecha ben. That child is not just yours, but you are the team that is going to give birth to that child. That's going to be the father of the new nation. Avraham's reaction is quite surprising. Vayipol Avraham al panav vayitzchak, he laughs. And then he says this really incredible statement, Lu Yishmael yichya lefanecha. If only Yishmael would live before you. Right? What does he mean? What kind of a response is that to the promise that he is going to have this miracle child with his wife, Sarah? His response is, listen, God, I have a child. I'm good, right? You don't have to make me these outlandish promises that this very, very old wife of mine is going to have a child. Why don't we just leave well enough alone? And God then steps in again and says, no, listen, Avraham. Vayomer, aval Sarah ishtecha, yoledet lecha ben. Sarah, I'm talking about her. Okay, what I think we're looking at here is that the beginning of God's, in the insertion of God into this story, sending subtle messages to the patriarch. And what we have is resistance on the part of the patriarch where he's not quite catching it. And I would say that this dynamic is going to continue into the next chapter. And here we have a kind of classic patriarch-matriarch situation. The patriarch is at the entrance to the tent, right? Vayera elav Hashem be'elonei mamrei v'hu yoshev petach ha'ohel kachom hayom. That's the natural place for the patriarch. He is the face to the outside world. If weary guests come by, he's the one who's going to see to their needs. We'll see in a moment where Sarah is, but he raises his eyes and he sees these three men. And he leaps into hosting mode. Vayarotz likratam, he runs to greet them. And then we have this kind of frenetic scene of hurrying and scurrying, repetition of the verbs larutz and limaher. Vayimaher Avraham. Okay, and now we've got our tent, ha'ohela. And if we're wondering where her space is, if his is petach ha'ohel, Sarah's space is in the ohel, in the recesses of the tent, way in the back. But he says to her, because she's part of the team, he kind of calls back into the tent, Mahari, right? You start hurrying up also, right? Need, woman, need, make some cakes. And he runs to the kettle. Okay, so all of this is going on. He's the host. He is the take charge person in this story. The matriarch is in the tent, not engaging with people or with God. But she's part of the team. She's again in this support mode. Okay, but suddenly something changes. These divine visitors pose a question to Avraham, and they say, "Aye Sarah ishtecha." Where is Sarah, your wife? And I was always drawn to this question because it doesn't use the more common biblical word for where. When someone, I learned this from my teacher here, I'm giving you little pieces of my background and my bio as we go. I had the great privilege of studying with Professor Nechama Leibovitz for many years. And one of the many, many things I learned from Nechama is that the word aye is not just an innocent word. It's not the same as efo, meaning where is something, I can't find it. But rather, it's rhetorical. Why is something not where it's supposed to be? God's initial question of ayeka to Adam, it does not mean where are you? I need you to tell me your location. When God says to Cain, after he kills his brother, hevel achicha, where is Hevel your brother? He doesn't mean tell me where you've stashed the body. And in fact, Rashbam picks up on this, and on the words "Aye Sarah ishtecha," afal pi shehayu yodim hayu shoalim. They know perfectly well where she is, but they ask anyway. And he ties this to Ayeka. I find this. I would take this just a tiny step further to say what's the meaning of a rhetorical question in this situation. They're not asking where is she. It's kind of a demand. Where is she? Right? Remember, Avraham, you were told about this miraculous birth a whole chapter ago, chapter 17. Why doesn't Sarah even know about it? Here we are to tell you now when this miracle is about to happen. Where is she? Right? Why isn't she by your side? God had told you back in chapter 17 that she is an essential part of this nation building team. How can she not be here with you? And Avraham, again, seems to be completely oblivious to this kind of subtle reprimand. And so he answers as does Cain when a rhetorical question is asked, and as does Adam when a rhetorical question is asked. He answers the rhetorical question as if it were a straightforward question asking for information. So he says, Hine hi ba'ohel, right? She's the Hine ba'ohel, that's where she is, that's where she lives, that's her natural habitat. Where else would she be? Right? Again, the messages are being sent, but he's not quite receiving them. And then they tell him it's going to come, this baby's coming this time next year. Sarah is eavesdropping, right? We have the petach ha'ohel, but it's because she's not in the public space. She's straining to hear this. And we have to, in the interest of time, skip all the good stuff in the middle, but the text then steps out of the story and gives us a little editorial comment. Avraham v'Sarah zekenim ba'im bayamim. They're very, very old. Chadal liyot l'Sarah orach kanashim, which literally means Sarah had ceased having the paths of women, which obviously means she stopped having her menstrual periods. She is over 90 years old. Vatitzchak Sarah bekirba, she laughs within herself, or some of the commentators, I think, interpret this beautifully. She laughs at her insides. She's laughing at her own internal construction. Are these innards going to produce a baby? Right? And she says, after I'm withered, I'm worn and withered, am I going to have enjoyment? And then, by the way, my husband is also old, right? But here what we have is some view into Sarah's mindset, where she sees herself as withered, she sees her insides are pointless, and perhaps even her life has lost its meaning. Chadal orach, I think perhaps it is giving us some view into her own mind that her paths, right? It's not an accident that she uses these words. The paths have ceased. Her paths have been cut off. This is the end of her story if she's not going to have a child, because that is her only avenue toward meaning, toward legitimacy. And what I want to plant already is that these are very, very resonant words. They're very important words. They appear exactly twice in the entire Hebrew Bible, twice in all of Tanakh. And if you play your cards right, and if I can talk quickly enough, we are going to get to the second time in a story that is in subversive dialogue with this one. Okay, we're going to move on now to the story of, Sarah's story ends. She does get her personal redemption, where God is paying attention to her. And I think we leave her story understanding that God is looking out for her, even if the people in her story are not quite on board. We get to the story of Isaac and Rebekah, and what we're going to see is something quite remarkable. Here, I think what we're going to get is an expansion of the role that we have seen thus far, even though she's generally lumped together with all of the matriarchs. We have the servant of Avraham who comes in search of a wife for Isaac, and he comes up with a little test. And the test is to say to the young woman at the well, please give me a little water. Hashkini na ma'at mayim mikadech. And he says, if she gives me and she gives my camels, that's the woman, that's the woman. And notice she does this and much, much more. And there's so much to be examined here. But what I really want to focus on are these wonderful words that are borrowed directly from Avraham's story. Vatimaher, vatimaher. Vatarotz, the words maher and roots are here again. I don't have them all here on the page, but this same terminology where now she, this young woman, and not a patriarch in the story, she is the take charge figure here. She's the one who looks after the needs of weary passersby. She's out in the world doing this, right? Kind of executive functioning, figuring out what has to be done and doing it. And the text goes on, I think, in many, many ways to reinforce this notion of Rivka, not just as any old matriarch, but she is also, at least when we first meet her, she is much more patriarchal than she is matriarchal. And in fact, she is going to follow the very route that Avraham took from Haran, which is, I don't know if you can see where I'm pointing here on this map, but it's up here, down in toward the land of Canaan. She follows that same trajectory. She is doing the same thing. And she's doing it with this really, really resonant word, elech. She's the only one of the matriarchs in Bereshit who was asked what she would like to do, and she states very clearly. This, of course, plays off of the first words that God says to Avraham, lech lecha. So not only is she the Avraham figure, but she takes it to the next level, which is that she doesn't have the benefit of a divine visitation, of an order, lech, but she figures it out on her own. And she says, elech, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know who these people are, but there's something here that I want to follow. She feels the spiritual pull, and she says, I'm going. And in case we miss the connection, the text gets even more explicit when the blessing that is given to Rebekah by her family is, "O sister, may you grow into thousands of myriads, may your offspring seize the gates of their foes, v'yirash zarech et sha'ar sonav," which is almost word for word the blessing that was given to Abraham after the story of the Akedah. I will bless you, you will be many, and your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes, v'yirash zaracha et sha'ar oivav. Okay, it's really, we would be remiss if we did not take note of all of these things. However, that's the first view of Rivka. What happens when Rivka is going to meet the actual patriarch in this story? And this happens in the 24th chapter of Breshit. And here things are looking a lot more familiar. Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basadeh. Yitzchak is out in a patriarchal space, the field. He is again the face to the world. We might say, as our tradition says, that it's also an internal space where he is in dialogue with God, right? Everybody knows what's he doing in the field. He's davening mincha. But there's something meditative that is suggested here, since there are no other people. In any case, he raises his eyes and he sees camels coming. Rivka raises her eyes. She sees Yitzchak, and the very first thing she does, vatipol me'al hagamal, she falls off her camel. Okay, I want you to just take note of these clues that were given as what's happening to her. She falls off her camel. Now, this is quite a thing to do, given the fact that in our first meeting with Rivka, she is the camel lady, right? She's the one who is completely in control of the camels. She's feeding them. She's drawing water until they're completely saturated with all that they need. She's in charge, and now she can't hold her balance on a camel. She falls off. Okay, and then she says to the servant, "Who is that man?" And the servant says, "That is my master." And the next thing she does is vatikach hatzaif vatitkas. She takes the veil and she covers herself. Right? This is literally an act of self-effacement. This phrase also has resonance in the book of Breshit. The only other woman who does the same thing in the book of Breshit is, of course, Tamar, when she's covering her identity, when she's in front of Yehuda, she covers herself with a veil. So here we have this take charge woman who's suddenly covering herself up, and then Yitzchak, picking up on this, takes her ha'ohela, okay, basically communicating to her, this is your new location. You're not going to be out there anymore. Let me accompany you into the tent, not just any tent, but the tent of Sarah, my mother. Okay, we talked about Freud a little bit. We're not going to go back to him, but whatever you want to think. And she was his wife, and he loved her, and he was comforted after his mother. Okay, so what we've got here is what seems to be a fairly surprising metamorphosis in the character of Rivka. And so the story, with some ups and downs, we end up in a place that is quite familiar. But again, the important thing is to notice that the story is not quite as monolithic as we thought it was. Notice these surprising possibilities. Okay, I just want to say the story ends in such a way that I think is actually reminiscent of Sarah, when she questioned her very worth when she wasn't able to have a child. And here in the story of Rivka, we have her questioning herself, these existential questions, actually not once, but twice, when she's pregnant and she thinks that there's something wrong with the pregnancy. She says, Im ken lama ze anochi, why do I even exist? And later, when she thinks that her sons are going to go off in the wrong direction, again, she questions her entire life. What good is my life? Lama li chayim. So as we exit her story, and we're not going to be able to really get into the story of Rachel and Yaakov, but what I did want to look at is this one statement that's made by Rachel, which is the most extreme expression of this existential angst, where she, in her great frustration at her childlessness, she turns to her husband and she says to him, Hava li banim ve'im ayin meta anochi. Give me children, if not, I shall die. Okay, couldn't be any more stark than that. And here I want to note a really amazing piece of writing in the 15th century. And I was first made aware of this by my teacher, Nachama Leibovitz, Zichron Libracha. Here, this sounds surprisingly modern, but on this verse where she says, give me children or I shall die, he says she got it all wrong. And he goes back to the Garden of Eden and he says there are two names of women in the Garden of Eden. One is Isha and one is Chava. And those two names indicate two purposes. The first teaches that woman was taken from man, right? Isha, emphasizing that like him, she was capable of understanding and advancing intellectually and morally. She has all the capabilities that he has. The second, Chava, alludes to the power of childbearing and rearing children, as is indicated by the name Chava, the mother of all the living. And now he gets to his point, which is, a woman deprived of the power of childbearing will be deprived of the secondary purpose and be left with the ability to do good or evil, just like the man who is sterile. Jacob was therefore angry with Rachel. That's how the story goes on, that he gets angry when she says this. He got angry at her when she said, give me children, or if not, I shall die. By exhibiting anger, he sought to reprimand her and make her understand this all-important principle. Her childlessness did not render her a dead person as far as their joint purpose in life was concerned, just the same as it would have been had he been childless. Okay, this is quite astounding. And I want to hold this in the back of our minds, because the way that Arama, that Akedat Yitzchak sees the truth of the situation, basically he's saying Yaakov can see it, Rachel can't see it, right? And we might extend that to say that the matriarchs in Bereshit in many cases can't see it, but what we know, we can hold this as background and take that with us as we leave this book and finally move on to the book of Judges, which is going to take everything that we have seen and basically flip it upside down. Okay. Here we are going to meet a woman by the name of Devorah, and we know already that something is unusual when she is introduced to us as an Isha Nevi'ah. Avraham, in the book of Bereshit, Avraham was described as a Navi, and there's a bit of an irony in that, again, because Sarah was so dependent on him to reach out to God for her, he never once prayed for her fertility. He did, however, pray for the fertility of the women of this foreign nation, for these people in Gerar, which is, I would say, a great curiosity and something that doesn't sit well in the story. But here we have the woman who is the prophet. And not only that, she is defined as Eshet Lapidot. Is she the wife of a guy named Lapidot? Or is she a woman of Lapidot? And Lapidot, of course, means, right, flames of torches. Right, just like when we read in the book of Proverbs, Eshet Chayil, we don't think that we're talking about a woman who's married to a guy named Chayil, right? She's a woman of valor. Here, this is a woman of torches. This is telling us something about her personality, about her character. He shofta et Yisrael ba'etahi, okay, and surprise after surprise after surprise, she's the judge. She is the spiritual leader of the people, and she is the practical leader of the people. V'hi yoshevet tachat tomer devorah, she is out there, right? She's out in the fields, under a tree, and all of the people came to her to get justice. And then she calls to Barak, and of course there's a lot of wonderful wordplay here between the Barak and these two luminescent figures. He's a lightning bolt, and she's a torch. But this light is going to be very reluctant to shine, right? She then brings the word of God to him, telling him what he must do in order to win the battle. And if you follow my instructions, you will win. And Barak says to her, oh, no, I don't think so. He says, Vayomer eleha Barak, im telchi imi, if you go with me, v'halachti, right? How totally different is this? If you go with me, I'll go. V'im lo telchi imi lo elech. Here, the man in the story, not only is he not saying elech, as Rivka said, and in fact, there are actually 4 women who say the word elech, 4 strong women in the Torah, the Tanakh, who say this word. Rivka is the first. We have here we have Devorah saying it, we have Ruth saying it, and the 4th is sort of a half. It's Miriam when she says, "Should I go?" When she says to the daughter of Paro, "Should I go ha'elech and get a nursemaid for this child?" Okay, that's just a fun fact. But here she is in the grand tradition of Rivka. She says elech, and his response is, "If you don't go and hold my hand in this battle, lo elech." Right, as empowered as Devorah is, it seems that's how unempowered the male protagonist in this story is. And she says to him with not more than a touch of irony, "Haloch elech imach." Okay, I'll go with you, but you should know it's not going to be good for you. It's not going to look good. People are going to mock you. right? I get the sense that the book of Judges is in a sense mocking the mockers, right? Where the men need the women, but if people find out that they need the women, they will be scorned, right? There's this kind of insider sense that we know how absurd this is, but here it is. And I would say that maybe even more significant than all of these surprising facts about a Devorah, I think more significant than what's there is perhaps what is not there. We don't have a single mention of motherhood. Does she have a child? We don't know if she's married. If her husband's name isn't Lapidot, is she married at all? But does she want children? Right? And if she's not a mother, is she anxious about it? Where's the request? Where's the pleading? Where's her tension with her husband? Any of that. It's entirely missing. It's not at all relevant to the story. And so I think that what we've got going on here is this kind of grand role reversal going on between men and women, where if we thought that women's story was monolithic, all of a sudden we're finding out that the absolute polar extreme is also possible, where the man has really not much of a clue about what's going on, and the woman has all control. So much so, and here I think the story really outdoes itself. It uses terminology that's borrowed from the greatest victory that the Torah has to offer, and that is, of course, the salvation at the sea, when the Exodus from Egypt, and here the same verbs are used, and some of these words are rare words, like vayahom, threw them into a panic. That's taken directly from the story of the splitting of the sea. We have the fleeing, we have the chariots, we have this phrase, lo nishar ad echad, not a single man was left, right? All of that terminology is used. And in case we missed the point, we have in both stories this grand singing song of praise of victory, Ashira, right? So what we've got here, right? The book of Judges, it doesn't suffice with presenting new women-centered narratives. That's not nearly good enough, but what it seems to insist on doing is rewriting familiar stories, challenging all of our assumptions about the natural roles of men and women. Everything is thrown up for review, and nothing at all is assumed. From here, we move on to another surprising woman, and that is Yael. And here we take more of the tropes that we saw in the book of Genesis, and we see how they are thrown up and turned upside down. Vateitzeh Yael likrat Sisra vatomer elav Sura Adoni. Come this way. Okay, and he turns toward her where ha'ohela. Here is a woman in a tent. She covers him with a blanket, and he says to her, in the grand tradition of biblical men speaking to biblical women, hashkini na ma'at mayim. These are the precise words that were spoken by the servant of Avraham to Rebecca. Hashkini na ma'at mayim. And instead of giving water, this time she does something completely different. She opens up the milk, and she gives him a different liquid entirely. Okay, he thinks he's safe in this female space, this matriarchal space. He asks for water, but instead she substitutes water for milk. Okay, and there is really tremendous subversion in this act. How so? This is right, the supremely maternal liquid of milk is going to be used for the very opposite of a maternal purpose. Instead of giving life to that person, she's going to prepare this general for death. He seems to notice that there's something unusual about her, and so he uses these terms that are used in the story of Avraham. He tells her stand. Notice the masculine form. Okay, we don't have time to go into that, but let's note it. Petach ha'ohel, you stand at the entrance to the tent, that's Avraham's space. And if anybody asks you, did you see a man here? Say no, right? He went that away, not he, no, he never saw him. Okay, and then when he is asleep, because that's what she has made sure that he will be doing, we have the most subversive element of this entire story, where she grabs hold of the tents, the thing that's holding up the tent, right? The very foundation, the tent pin, right? And she takes that's her weapon of choice, and she's going to pound that into his head. And I think in a really overtly very symbolic manner, what we've got here is bringing down the tent and everything that it symbolizes, all of our expectations about what good Jewish women do. And in case we missed the point, she bangs it into his birakato, which I think is a play, at least a sound play on the ineffectual male protagonist, Barak, Barakato. And then carrying things even further, in case this weren't bad enough, she goes out to meet Barak and she says, Lech ve'areka, right? He comes running up, ready to save the day. And she says, okay, come, I'll show you where you need to go. I'm going to show you a dead body. But she says, Lech ve'areka. Those words are spoken only twice in the Bible. Once when God says to Avraham, Lech lecha el haaretz asher areka. And here she speaks, right? It's not enough to speak in the language of the men in this story. Here we have women speaking in the language of God. Okay, here in her song of victory, Deborah sings this. And here, you've been wonderful out there, even though I haven't heard very much from you. She's in this song of triumph. We finally get to the second and final use of this wonderful phrase that we saw in the story of Sarah, Chadal Orach. Okay, and if we remember, she used this, or the text used this, to describe this sense of hopelessness, of purposelessness, of being disassembled in the absence of having children. And now we have this prophet singing out, Bimei Shamgar ben Anat, Bimei Yael, Chadilu Arachot. Okay, paths ceased. On the surface, I believe that she is talking, right? She's talking about the Israelites, but I think very close to the surface, what we've got here is what I would like to call ode to women. Very close. She's singing about Yael and her incredible abilities, and I think what she's strongly hinting here is that when usual paths are cut off, Yilchu arachot akalkalot, there are roundabout paths to be pursued. Right, and here what she's saying is she could just as easily be singing about herself. They both demonstrate through their actions, through their story, that there are many paths, many unexpected, unforeseen, but to a life that is very, very worthwhile. And to make her point in a way that I think is just plain mischievous, she says, Ad shekamti devora shekamti aim b'Yisrael. Right, this non-mother, this story that has nothing to do with motherhood, she has the gall to call herself a mother in Israel, which is, I think, a kind of radical redefinition of motherhood itself. Right, she mothers her people by bringing them prophecy, by judging them, by leading them to military victory, by in all of these arachot akalkalot, these roundabout paths. And we might say that Yael mothers her people in very unconventional ways too, by giving this maternal liquid only to kill the enemy general, by using her tent as a cover for her actions, right, killing this man so that her people can be safer. And in the stinging conclusion to the story, to the song, Devorah says this, Tevorach minashim Yael, more blessed, most blessed of women be Yael, minashim ba'ohel tevorach, even more blessed than the women of the tent, right? Now these women in the tent are plenty blessed, right? But this tent crushing political assassin might be even more blessed than these good tent dwelling women of the book of Bereshit. Okay, now, what's going on here? And we've got to ask this. There's a lot more to do. And next time we meet, I would like to take this to the next level, which is the story of infertility that is presented in the book of Judges, and in the hands of the book of Judges that is unrecognizable. That, of course, is the story of Manoach and his wife and the birth of Samson, but that's for another time. I want to just take this story that we've seen here and ask the question that we need to ask, which is, isn't this just a bit over the top? Right, we found a model of biblical woman to replace the old one, but only to discover that it comes at the expense of man, right? Does it have to be a zero-sum game where if the women are enabled, then the men are completely unenabled? Does it have to be at the expense of men, of tradition, of motherhood itself? And here's my own point of view on all of this, and I'm very proud of this formulation. I believe that the book of Judges is not interested in parity, it is rather interested in parody. And I think what it's really getting at is this, a pendulum swing, where in the book of Bereshit, it starts with the extreme situation, with one extreme, even though within that, as we saw, there are fluctuations. But women's worth for many of the women is felt, they feel that they can achieve it almost exclusively through childbirth.
Judy, I'm afraid I have to step in and give you your 10-minute warning.
Right. Okay. Got it. Okay, that must have been the voice of the Lord. I heard, do you all hear it? I'm a prophet, I'm a prophet. Okay. And it ends up with the opposite extreme in the book of Judges, where women's worth is almost everything else, everything other than those things that were presented in the book of Bereshit. And I think the pendulum is the right image here, but because it shows us where if everything in its opposite is possible, the strong hint here is that the real goal is this vast space in between the extremes, where, if I understand correctly, pendulums spend most of their time. Right? It's really aiming at this internal space in between. And that middle ground is, in fact, not parody, but parity, right? A reality in which women and men both have equal, unlimited options, neither one at the expense of the other. And I think above all, the sequel chain that we've studied here, right? One story to another, all borrowing language, borrowing themes, it warns us against a kind of narrow, simplistic classification, against monolithic labeling. And I hope it at least warns us to stop asking questions such as, what is a biblical woman? Or, as Freud asked, what does a woman want? Right? That what we're seeing here is, with this dynamic sequeling that we see in the Tanakh, throughout the Tanakh, the Bible's answer to both of these questions, right, as not just about women, but with all human beings. What are they? What do they want? The answer is everything. And here in conclusion, because I don't want to get the Lord angry, in conclusion, okay, so we're approaching Rosh Hashanah, and I think these texts are appropriate subject matter for this Chag. First of all, Hashem pakad et Sarah. The story of Sarah is going to be read on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, but also Rosh Hashanah traditionally is viewed as the day that the world was created. Hayom harat olam, we're going to say on Rosh Hashanah. The world was born today. And I want to say that in the spirit of everything that we've studied today, I want to go back to the creation story and take a closer look at the very first biblical woman. And it's in this foundational story that I think we're going to find what is arguably the strongest support for the notion that parity between the sexes is the ideal in the eyes of the Bible, right? We recall that in the view of the Akedat Yitzchak, that great commentator, the first woman, he claims, is comprised of two parts, two names, Isha and Chava. But I want to add a third. The third is this. The very first name that a biblical woman is given is Ha'adam. God created Ha'adam. God created Ha'adam in God's image, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, right, everything that's true of man is equally true of the woman. And I would like to argue this is her first and arguably her ideal, her most fundamental identity, right? She is fully half of this creature that God created that is called Adam. She's 100% equal to man. She's told to advance, conquer, create, produce. She's 100% equal before God. God speaks equally to both of them, blesses both of them. And in this case, our sequel is not quite linear, but maybe it's a little bit circular, where we end up where we started, that the goal is kind of, it's stated up front. This is where we need to get back to, where neither man nor woman is derivative of the other. Neither one is limited in potential. Neither one is primary and the other secondary, but both have infinite value, infinite worth and dignity. Okay, and here is my postscript, and I'm going to say it quickly. I want to say that a lot of what I've said here is probably obvious to a YCT audience, but I want to point out that it's important to say that even as we enter the year 5783, in too many settings, it is not. And here in Israel, the terrible term hadarat nashim, right, the kind of erasure of women, has become frightfully common. We've seen the erasure of women from public view on buses, in magazines, in stores, in jobs, on the sidewalks, in toys. Notice here, the mother and the sister are erased in this sanitized version of this toy that's being sold. It's just incredible. And I think that the text, women's presence and the argument goes something like this, right? That women present a kind of spiritual challenge to men. Again, the men are the primary Jews. Women are an impediment to that. And so the answer to that, the solution, is to remove women from view. And I think that these texts that we're looking at remind us that women are not supposed to be viewed as other, right? Not to be auxiliaries, but as absolute equals. And if we extend this idea to Jewish law, we reach the conclusion that women's needs must be an essential part of any halachic or public policy decision. And of course, it's important to have women as part of that process. And I want to end by paying tribute to these two great Talmidei Chachamim, who were rare shining lights in fearless halachic and moral leadership. Both were way ahead of their time. Especially in matters that relate to promoting the full dignity of women, and in particular, in relation to the persistent problem of aguna. This is Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, who we just noted the 30th yahrzeit, and Rabbi Simcha Kraus, who died this year, both of blessed memory, Yehi Zichron Baruch. And in a resounding repudiation of the mindset that sought to marginalize or stereotype women, Berkovitz wrote this: "It is always men who express views about women. Even when statements are most appreciative of the women, they speak of her importance for man, as if the meaning of her existence were fully comprehended by what she represents as an adjunct to complete the life of man." Right? To Rabbis Kraus and Berkovitz, this mindset is damaging to both women and men. And at its worst, it leaves women on the margins, and that can contribute to the ongoing failure of our halachic authorities to take bold action in addressing the biggest problems we have. And of course, get refusal at the top is at the top of that list. And in the perspectives of both Berkovitz and Kraus, the corrective to this mindset is to approach halacha as a dynamic process which is in constant dialogue with the needs of the day. As Berkovitz said, halacha is meant to render the Torah ethically significant, spiritually meaningful in a given historic situation. And to bring it all back to the learning that we did today, the vibrant conversation that takes place between stories, I believe that this kind of conversation, with that internal conversation, the Bible itself is modeling that dynamic nature of the system that beckons us to keep that conversation going. And I will end with my prayer, Yehi Ratzon, that we will commit ourselves to making 5783 a better year, a year that honors the outstanding moral leadership of the two leaders that I just spoke of, by all of us doing our part to move the conversation forward. Thank you very much. Shana Tova, everyone. Should be a good one for us all.